Photographers have been giving Nikon heat for the Z6 III's dynamic range performance, but is it really that bad? What's up y'all, it's Project Photography back with another video, and today this is the Nikon Z6 III and I've been using it for the past month for my landscape photography, and I have so many opinions on this camera's performance. But I have a really hot take about the Z6 III. I think the hate that it's been getting for its dynamic range performance is unfair. Yeah, I said it. There's a lot of photographers out there saying that they were going to cancel their Z6 III orders simply because of dynamic range. And honestly, I don't think it's justified. But we can't give a hot take about the Z6 III dynamic range performance without first talking about it. And luckily for me, as a landscape photographer, this is the one niche that really pushes dynamic range to its extremes. And when it comes to Z6 III's performance, the shadows is where I feel like the Z6 III gets tested the most, because I'm usually exposing for the highlights and then bringing up the shadows back in post. And one thing I found is that when I do that, I can tell that the shadows are noticeably a little bit softer and there's more noise introduced. And now this is kind of an issue, obviously, especially when I'm exposing for those highlights, because I want to retain as much highlight detail as possible. And especially when comparing the shadows to the rest of the image, I can tell that they are softer and there is a bit of a drop off when going from those shadows to the other parts of the image. And of course, this is something that's prevalent in all cameras when you're pushing the dynamic range like that, but I feel like the Z6 III's performance isn't as good as something like the original Z6. With the original Z6, I found that we just got cleaner shadows overall, the image doesn't become as soft, and there's not as much noise. And something else to note too is that when you're using the electronic shutter off of the Z6 III, it is not as clean when it comes to dynamic range as mechanical shutter, which is a big reason why I'm so glad they kept in the mechanical shutter, because it just performs better relative to the electronic shutter. And mind you, when I am talking about dynamic range, I am talking about this camera at base ISO 100, mainly because when I'm shooting landscape photography, that's what I'm doing majority of the time to get the best dynamic range. Something else to keep in mind too is that when I'm talking about the dynamic range in terms of performance, especially in the shadows being soft and a little bit noisy, this is something that you're only really going to find when you're pixel peeping to the max. I mean, when you look at it from afar and from 100% view, the images do look clean, and I captured a lot of photos in very high contrast scenarios, and honestly, I was pretty happy with how the images came out. I don't feel like dynamic range is going to be the reason that you're not getting clean photos, which is a big reason why I feel like a lot of people are overstating how bad the dynamic range performance is on the Z6 III. Like, is it as good as the original Z6 even? No, of course not, but we are talking about big leaps in camera technology when it comes to the sensor, and so there is just going to be a little bit of a drop off when it comes to dynamic range. But even using it for something like landscape photography, I was still able to get amazing clean images, and honestly, that's all that really matters. And I hear a lot of people complaining about the dynamic range when it comes to the Z6 III without even mentioning pixel shift, because pixel shift does increase the dynamic range by a lot. There's a 4, 8, 16, and a 32 shot mode, and all those different modes will increase the dynamic range. But obviously when you go up to the 16 and the 32 modes, you are getting those 96 megapixel images, which means that we're going to get better dynamic range as a whole. And man, those pixel shifted images are super clean, top to bottom, from the shadows to the highlights, and I really feel like the dynamic range is so much easier to push while getting clean photos. And yes, although you cannot use pixel shift when things are moving, there's quite a bit of scenarios where things are not moving and you're able to use pixel shift. Even though there is a limitation on using pixel shift, I do feel like it moves around that dynamic range issue by a lot. And even though for me, I'm always exposing for the highlights and bringing back the shadows in post, I did find that the Z6 III is able to retain a lot of those highlight details, even if they are overblown just by a little bit. And because the Z6 III is a Nikon camera, we are getting those beautiful Nikon colors. They feel nice and saturated, they're clean, it's nice and contrasty overall, and it feels like a Nikon image, which is why I come to these cameras. It gives you the same feel as any other Nikon camera, and the images are going to look absolutely stunning. And I just really feel like when it comes to dynamic range, again, this is not going to be the reason why you're not getting clean images. The dynamic range is perfectly capable of capturing so many different high contrast scenarios, and I feel like the hate it's been getting is unjustified, because there's so many different features that were improved with the Z6 III that a lot of photographers simply ignored. Because there's a ton of different features that were upgraded from something like the Z6, and that's the comparison I'm using because I had an original Z6 that I upgraded from. And if we just continue to harp on the dynamic range, issue, then we completely mitigate all these different feature upgrades. And one of them is actually the display. They did a really great job in improving this. For example, we do have a flip screen now, which I actually found to be incredibly useful. There's a lot of times when I was in Mammoth at a very awkward position and I was only able to see the screen because I had a fully articulated screen. And there were a lot of situations where I was like, okay, a 3-way tilting screen or even a 2-way tilting screen would not allow me to see the screen. And I'm really glad a fully articulated screen is on the Z6 III because you can simply see the screen in any orientation. Something else I really like was that when I put the camera into vertical orientation, all the information went vertically. Now, it's a really simple upgrade, but I think it just makes the usability so much better on the Z6 III, especially in vertical orientation. I also found the screen to be much sharper when I'm manual focusing because when I punch in, I don't lose much resolution at all, and it is much more stable than something like the Z6. And do you guys remember the original Z6's horizon level? Yeah, that huge bubble right in the middle of the screen that took up like half of it? Well, luckily with the Z6 III, this is improved because now it is simply a clean line, so you can much easily see your composition, whereas before, you have this huge circle and a lot of times I'd find myself going out of it in order to just see my composition. And the last thing when it comes to the screen is that you can actually change the information that is put on the screen. You can customize it and you can even change the way that it's displayed. And for me, this is really nice because I can change whether I want something like a histogram on there or the horizon level or more information or less. Just makes it so that you can customize it to the exact way that you want. But something that I was testing out and I really want to make sure I had a good idea of is the EVF. Now, when I'm using the EVF, I use it a lot for, punching in to make sure I'm in focus, especially if it's really bright out and I can't see the back LCD. I found the EVF to be much sharper, much more clear and crisp, and it has to probably do with that 5.7 megapixel EVF in here. And I think it's really nice to look at, especially when it's really bright out. And this upgrade that I'm about to mention was implemented into the Z6 II, but something that I did not have access to with the original Z6, and that's having dual card slots. We do have that CF Express and the SD card UHS-2, by the way. And one way that I like to set up actually is I like to have the CF Express card hold all of my photography and then the SD card hold all of my video stuff. And I like that separation because now I know, okay, this card is for photography, this card is for video. And it's really nice when I'm shooting because I can know that, all right, the photos are going to the CF Express card, whereas all the videos are going to the SD card, and helps me compartmentalize those two different components of my content creation and photography. But something else that the Z6 II also had that the Z6 III has is the 15-minute exposure times. Now, this is really nice because when I had my Z6, I would have to set a time mode if I wanted to shoot over a 30-second exposure. Now, it's a little bit more cumbersome because I have to use my phone and the timer on there. Click the shutter once and then click it again once the timer's up. But 15 minutes is more than long enough to capture pretty much any exposure that I would want. And the really cool thing is that any exposure past about 30 seconds, it does a little countdown, which is really cool because you can see exactly how much time you have left on the exposure. But something I did want to point out is battery life. Now, I feel like the battery life is kind of a weak spot on the Z6 III because I did find myself having to change it out relatively frequently. Let's just say if I was shooting a pretty decent amount of video and photography, if I'm out there in the field shooting landscapes, I did find that I'd probably change my battery like once a shoot, give or take. So I usually carry around 3 or 2 extra batteries at the minimum, and I found that that is more than sufficient enough to cover the battery life for the Z6 III. And I feel like the battery is something that can be improved on these mirrorless cameras because for a hot second now, even with the original Z6, not the greatest battery life, so I hope Nikon introduces a higher capacity battery just to make sure that we get more battery life when it comes to these cameras. And the last major upgrade that I want to talk about when it comes to the Z6 III is the improvements when it comes to ergonomics. The body is a little bit thicker, it's a little bit heavier, but I feel like it fits much nicer into my hand. It's contoured a lot more nicely, and the grip is nice and deep, so it's really comfortable to hold for a very long time. It's really nice improvements to the ergonomics and just makes it a much nicer camera to hold for a longer period of time, or even when you're adjusting it on your tripod. And even though a lot of these improvements are small, it does add up to make a really nice experience and a great quality of life improvement when it comes to the Z6 III. Because a lot of photographers want to completely dismiss the Z6 III simply because of its dynamic range performance, or even just what they've heard about it, without even giving it a shot or even making sure to test and find out what they think for themselves. And when it comes to dynamic range, I don't even think it's that bad. Yes, it isn't as good as something like the original Z6, but when it came out into the real world, I found myself choosing the Z6 III over the Z6 because the quality of life improvements were so great that the experience was just completely different. Because of its small, incremental upgrades, it allowed me to just capture better landscape images because it was easier to see my screen, it was easier to see the camera in different orientations, and the experience overall made me gravitate towards this camera even though the Z6 might have better dynamic range. To completely ignore all these different upgrades and quality of life improvements of the Z6 III just because dynamic range isn't as good as something like the Z6, I just think is unjustified and unfair. And of course there are better cameras over the Z6 III when it comes to landscape photography. For example, the Z7 II has the best image sensor performance out of any other Nikon camera, sporting a 45 megapixel sensor and base ISO of 64 without any stacked sensor improvements or anything like that, which means we're going to get better dynamic range overall. But something like the Z8, for example, will also sport a 45 megapixel sensor with a stacked sensor, so we're not getting as good image quality when it comes to dynamic range performance as something like a Z7 II. Yes, you can choose those better cameras, but the Z8 is also $1,500 more than the Z6 III, and the Z7 II quality of life is not as good as this camera. And yes, the Z6 III isn't the most ideal camera for landscape photography, but when you look at these images, you can't doubt that it can take absolutely stunning photos. And at the end of the day, if you want to use a specific camera for landscape photography, just go ahead and use it. And it's a big reason why I stuck with the Z6 III over going with any other camera. Because no camera is going to be perfect, and that's okay. That doesn't mean that our photography has to suffer because we don't have the exact perfect tool to go and shoot landscape photography. And I just feel like if you're so worried about, oh, this one specific individual spec, then you completely ignore everything else about the camera. And that's a big reason why I feel like the hate that the Z6 III has been getting for its dynamic range performance is unfair. And look, the dynamic range is not nearly as bad as people are claiming it to be. What I found in real world testing, it is still able to come out with pretty good images that are clean. Dynamic range is perfectly fine, especially if you're shooting at base ISO of 100. And if you're shooting landscape photography, that's what you should be shooting at anyways. And if you had a higher megapixel body like that Z7 II or the Z8, I really feel like the Z6 III would actually make an incredible second body because you're using it as a telephoto lens, things aren't going to be moving when it's really far away. By using pixel shift, we're able to increase the dynamic range by a lot and increase that resolution if we are using that 16 and 32 shot mode. So if you wanted a second body but you already have a higher megapixel body as your main body, I really feel like the Z6 III would actually do an amazing job at that. But let's say you wanted to move to full frame and you were thinking about getting the Z6 III for landscape photography. Yes, it isn't the perfect camera for it, but to be quite honest with you, this camera is amazing for landscape photography. I was able to capture some incredible images over this past month. And this camera will continue to be my main camera body for a very, very long time. I don't upgrade my camera bodies that frequently, so this is going to be my main camera body paired with my wide angle 14 to 30. I think it's going to be an amazing combination, and I'm so excited to capture more incredible landscape photography. But I think all this is to say, don't fall into the hype of the online hate train, because it's really easy to see something and see that it has just one flaw in it and just harp on it so much that you completely ignore all the other improvements that are amazing about a certain camera, because everyone wants to come into this mob mentality and just bash on this one single thing. But it's unfair at the end of the day. I mean, all the hate that came out was literally the week after the camera was announced, when these different sensor performances tests were coming out. They're saying, oh, the dynamic range is one stop less than other cameras like the Z6 or something. And then everyone just completely freaked out without even giving this camera a chance. So don't fall into the hype train. Do your own testing, do your own research to make sure if this camera is fit for you. And for me, it 100% is, and I've loved using this camera. So thank you so much for experiencing the world with me today. Let me know what you think about the Z6 III down in the comment section down below. And is my take unfair and completely BS? Let me know, because I want to hear what you guys think. So please feel free to rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.